It was a fading afternoon at Thomas Herrera's ranch when he heard the desperate scratching at the main door of his cabin. At first, he thought it was just the desert wind playing tricks on his weathered wooden walls, but the sounds grew more insistent, more urgent, carrying a quality of desperation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. When he opened the door with his rifle firmly in hand, ready for whatever threat might await him, he was completely paralyzed by what he saw before him. 3 wounded wolves lay collapsed on his wooden porch, their trembling bodies marked by deep wounds and dried blood that told a story of unimaginable suffering. The largest one, clearly the alpha male of the pack, had a hind leg mangled by a steel trap that still hung grotesquely from his limb, the metal teeth biting deep into flesh and bone. The female was panting with difficulty, her breathing shallow and labored, with cuts that appeared to have been made by knives, deliberate and cruel marks across her beautiful grey coat. Between them, a small pup sought refuge, pressing close to his parents, his yellow eyes filled with terror and plea that seemed almost human in their intensity. What struck Thomas most was not just the deplorable state of these magnificent animals, but the way they looked at him with an intelligence that defied everything he knew about wild creatures. There was no aggression in their eyes, none of the savage instinct one would expect from wounded wolves, cornered and vulnerable. Instead, there was something almost human in their gaze, a desperate plea that transcended the boundaries between species, as if they understood that this grey-bearded man with his weathered face and noble heart was their only hope for survival in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. The male wolf, gathering his last remaining strength despite the obvious agony it caused him, dragged his mutilated leg forward and extended his muzzle toward Thomas, lowering his proud head in a gesture of submission and supplication, as if he were literally begging to be allowed entry into this human's domain. It was an image that broke the soul. A family of wolves seeking refuge from the very enemy their entire species had learned to fear through generations of hunting and persecution. Thomas had seen much cruelty in his 40 years of life in the unforgiving desert, had witnessed the worst that humanity could offer, but this scene awakened in him an indignation he had never felt before, a rage that burned hot in his chest. Someone had tortured these noble creatures for pure malice, for entertainment, and now they had come seeking the only thing left to them in their desperation, the compassion of a stranger who by all rights should have been their natural enemy. The old cowboy stood there for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the rifle, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. These were not just wounded animals seeking shelter from the elements. These were sentient beings who had made a conscious choice to approach a human dwelling, to put themselves at the mercy of their ancestral enemy, because whatever they had fled from was worse than the risk of approaching mankind. The female wolf lifted her head slightly, a soft whimper escaping her throat, not a threat but a mother's plea for her family. The pup, no more than a few months old, pressed closer to his mother's side, his small body trembling not just from pain, but from fear that went bone deep. Thomas looked into their eyes one by one and saw something that shook him to his core. He saw intelligence, yes, but more than that he saw trust, desperate and fragile, but trust nonetheless. They had chosen him, this solitary rancher who lived alone on the edge of civilization, as their last hope. The weight of that choice, that trust, settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. Without hesitating another second, Thomas set his rifle aside, the weapon clattering against the doorframe as he knelt down beside the 3 wounded wolves, his movements slow and deliberate, careful not to startle them despite their obvious helplessness. "Come on, friends," he whispered in a voice he had never used to speak to wild animals before, a voice gentle and warm, filled with a compassion he had thought lost to years of solitary living. "You are safe here. Nobody will hurt you anymore. I give you my word." To his complete amazement, the wolves seemed to understand his words perfectly, or at least the intent behind them. The male, dragging his wounded leg painfully across the threshold, was the first to cross into the cabin, each movement obviously causing him agony, but his determination unwavering. He was followed by the female, who delicately carried the pup in her mouth, her maternal instinct overriding her own pain as she limped into the warm interior of the human dwelling. Once inside the warm cabin, the three animals curled up next to the fireplace as if they knew exactly where they should be, as if they had lived in human dwellings all their lives. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and the warmth seemed to ease some of the tension from their battered bodies. Thomas closed the door against the cooling desert night and added more logs to the fire, building it up until it roared with life-giving heat. The golden light of the flames fully illuminated the wounds of his unexpected guests, and what he saw filled him with a silent but devastating fury that threatened to consume him. The steel trap on the male's leg had been designed not just to capture, but to inflict maximum suffering possible. The metal teeth had torn through muscle and bone, and from the infection that was visible, spreading in angry red lines up the wolf's leg, it had been there for days. The deliberate cruelty of it made Thomas's stomach turn. The cuts on the female were precise, deliberate, made by someone who enjoyed the pain of others, who had taken their time to inflict maximum damage without killing. They formed a pattern across her sides, as if someone had been practicing their knife work on a living canvas. And the pup, besides being malnourished to the point where his ribs showed through his thin coat, had small burns on his fur, circular marks that could only have been made by cigarettes or heated metal pressed against his small body. "This was not done to hunt them," Thomas muttered as he prepared warm water and bandages, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. This was done for entertainment, for the sick pleasure of watching them suffer. He worked throughout the entire night, tending to the wounds, his hands gentle despite their size and the calluses from years of ranch work. First, he freed the male's leg from the trap, a delicate operation that required him to pry apart the rusty metal teeth while the wolf remained perfectly still, not uttering a single whimper despite what must have been excruciating pain, as if he understood that Thomas was there to help him and that any sudden movement might make things worse. The process was slow and methodical. Thomas had to cut away the dead tissue around the wound, clean out the infection with alcohol that must have burned like fire, and then carefully bandage the leg with strips torn from his own shirts. Through it all, the wolf watched him with those intelligent golden eyes, never showing aggression, only a deep weariness, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Next he cleaned and bandaged the cuts on the female, who actually licked his hand in a gesture of thanks when he finished with a particularly deep gash on her shoulder. Her tongue was warm and rough against his weathered skin, and Thomas found himself blinking back tears at the simple gesture of affection from a creature who had every reason to hate humanity. Finally, he fed the pup warm milk mixed with a little whiskey to help with the pain, and wrapped him in his softest blanket, the one his grandmother had made for him years ago. The little wolf pup looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for such a young creature, eyes that had seen too much cruelty in his short life. What surprised him most was the way these wild animals behaved in his home. They did not knock anything over, they did not make a mess, they showed no sign of aggression or wildness. It was as if a family of well-mannered guests had arrived seeking shelter, understanding the rules of domestic life instinctively. When dawn painted the cabin windows orange and gold, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor, Thomas fell asleep in his chair by the fireplace, exhausted from his night's work. When he woke up 3 hours later, his neck stiff from sleeping upright, he found something that left him speechless. The pup was sleeping curled up in his lap, small and warm, trusting him completely, while the parents were standing guard by the door, positioned strategically to protect both their offspring and their savior from any threat that might come through that entrance. The male wolf, despite his injured leg, stood tall and alert, his ears swiveling at every sound from outside. The female lay beside him, but her eyes were open and watchful, scanning the room constantly. They had appointed themselves his guardians while he slept, repaying his kindness with their own form of protection. It was a scene that defied everything Thomas had believed about the relationship between wild animals and humans, a tableau of mutual trust and respect that seemed to belong more in a fairy tale than in the harsh reality of the Arizona desert. But what Thomas did not know was that in the nearby town's saloon, 3 brothers known for their cruelty had already noticed the absence of their favorite toys and were planning to recover their victims at any price. The Salinas brothers, Victor, Diego, and Ricardo, were not men who took loss lightly, especially when it came to their twisted entertainments. They had spent weeks training those wolves, as they called it, though training was just their word for systematic torture designed to break the animals' spirits. The fact that the wolves had escaped and found refuge was not just an inconvenience to them, it was a personal insult that demanded retribution. The following days passed as if Thomas had gained a completely new family, one bound not by blood but by something deeper and more profound. The wolves not only recovered physically under his care, but they displayed an intelligence and loyalty that challenged everything he thought he knew about wild animals. The male wolf, whom Thomas had begun to call Guardian because of the way he protected his family with fierce devotion, had learned to walk with his bandaged leg, adapting quickly to the support Thomas had fashioned from old leather and wood. He always positioned himself between the door and the rest of the pack, a sentinel who never truly rested, always alert for danger. The female, whom he called Hope for the light she had brought to his solitary life, followed him around the house like a protective shadow, her presence constant and comforting. She seemed to understand his moods, pressing close when he was sad, sitting beside him when he ate his lonely meals, making them less lonely by her simple presence. And the little one, baptized as Courage for his incredible resistance and spirit despite everything he had endured, had begun to play and run around the ranch as if he had been born there, bringing a joy to the place that had been absent for far too long. But the most extraordinary thing was how they responded to Thomas's daily routines, integrating themselves into ranch life as if they had always been domestic animals. When he went out to feed the cattle, Guardian accompanied him, limping but steady, actually helping to keep the livestock in order. The cattle, which should have been terrified of a wolf, seemed to sense that Guardian meant them no harm, that he was there as a protector, not a predator. Hope had begun hunting mice in the barn, keeping the provisions safe from rodents more effectively than any cat ever had. And Courage simply brought joy with his innocent antics, chasing butterflies, playing with old rope toys Thomas made for him, being the puppy he should have always been allowed to be. 1 week after their arrival, while Thomas was repairing a broken fence under the scorching desert sun, he heard the ominous sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the bright sky, and his heart sank when he recognized the sinister shapes. The Salinas brothers, Victor, Diego, and Ricardo, known in 3 counties for their cruelty to animals and their illegal fur trade business. They wore hats adorned with teeth and claws from the beasts they had tortured and killed, trophies of their cruelty, and their faces showed the kind of evil that only comes from years of inflicting suffering without remorse or consequence. "Herrera!" Victor shouted, his voice carrying across the desert like the cry of a vulture. "We know you have something that belongs to us. Those wolves are our property, and we have come to collect them." Thomas set down his hammer with deliberate slowness, his movements calm despite the rage building in his chest, and walked toward them with a firm step. But from the corner of his eye, he saw something that surprised him even more than the brothers' arrival. The three wolves had emerged from the cabin and had strategically positioned themselves around the ranch without any signal from him. Guardian stood near the main door. Despite his injured leg, Hope had moved toward the barn where she could flank any attacker, and Little Courage had hidden behind a barrel, but Thomas could see his small form tense and ready. They had all taken positions that would allow them to defend the territory if necessary, showing a tactical intelligence that was almost military in its precision. "There is nothing on my ranch that belongs to you," Thomas replied, keeping his voice calm but firm, though inside he was preparing for violence. "Those wolves came to me seeking help, and I gave it freely. They choose to stay of their own free will." Diego Salinas spat on the ground, the gesture full of contempt, and pointed toward the cabin where Guardian stood like a grey statue. "Those three wolves are ours. We were educating them for weeks before they disappeared. They are valuable property, and you have no right to keep them." "Educating?" Thomas's voice filled with a contempt that made even the horses shift nervously. "Is that what you call torture now? Is that what you call burning a puppy with cigarettes and putting a grown wolf in a trap for days? Education?" Ricardo laughed with a cackle that made even the desert ravens take flight in alarm. "Wild animals need to learn who is in charge, and we are very good teachers. Pain is an excellent educator, do you not think? It teaches respect, teaches fear, teaches obedience." "Then you're about to learn who really is in charge here," Thomas replied, slowly moving toward his rifle that was leaning against a fence post, his movements deliberate and threatening. Victor noticed the movement, and his hand moved toward his revolver, the leather of his holster creaking in the tense silence. "Careful, Herrera. It is 3 against 1. You may be tough, but you are not bulletproof, and neither are your new pets." "You are wrong," said a voice, quiet but full of determination. It was Thomas, but his words carried a weight that made the brothers look around in confusion until they realized that Thomas was not alone, not truly. The three wolves had emerged fully from their positions and had placed themselves beside him, forming a defensive line that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. Guardian, despite his wounded leg, showed his fangs in a fierce snarl that revealed teeth designed by nature to tear and rend. Hope had her fur bristled, standing on end, making her appear twice her normal size, and her eyes were fixed on the intruders with an intensity that promised violence. Even Little Courage was growling with an intensity that did not match his small size, his tiny teeth bared in defiance of the men who had hurt him. "We are 4 against 3, Thomas continued, his hand now resting on his rifle, "and I assure you that my friends here have more reasons to fight than you do. They are fighting for their family, for their freedom, for their very lives. What are you fighting for? Your sick entertainment, your cruel games?" The Salinas brothers exchanged nervous glances, the bravado draining from their faces. They had come expecting to find a lonely cowboy with 3 wounded and frightened wolves, animals broken by their torture. Instead, they found themselves facing something they had never seen before, an alliance between human and beast forged in mutual respect and love, a united front that challenged everything they believed about the natural order. "This is not over, Herrera," Victor growled as he made his horse retreat, the animal sensing its rider's fear and dancing nervously. "We will return with more men, with enough guns to turn your ranch into a graveyard. Those wolves will be ours, one way or another. We will be waiting," Thomas responded, without taking his eyes off the three riders who were leaving, his hand still on his rifle. "But know this, if you come back, it will be the last mistake you ever make. These wolves are under my protection now, and I protect what is mine." That night, while the four friends shared dinner by the fireplace, the wolves eating fresh meat Thomas had prepared for them, while he ate his simple meal of beans and cornbread, Thomas could not get the threat of the Salinas brothers out of his head. He knew they would return, knew that men like that could not let a slight go unanswered. But when he looked at the determined eyes of his wolf companions, saw the trust and loyalty there, he knew that together they would face whatever danger came their way. Guardian seemed to sense his worry and padded over despite his injured leg, resting his great head on Thomas's knee in a gesture that had become routine between them. Hope curled up at his feet, her warmth comforting against the cool night air, and Courage settled against his other leg, already falling asleep with the trust of youth. What he did not know was that the Salinas brothers were already recruiting gunmen from the worst dens of the territory, gathering a small army of mercenaries and outlaws, and that they had put a price on the heads of Thomas and his three protectors that would attract every desperate man within 100 miles. The days that followed were filled with tense calm at the ranch, like the oppressive quiet before a thunderstorm. Thomas maintained his routines, tending to his cattle, repairing fences, maintaining his equipment, but always with one eye on the horizon and weapons within reach. His wolf companions seemed to sense the tension in the air, their own instincts screaming that danger was approaching. Guardian had begun to patrol the ranch perimeter every night, his limping gait not slowing his vigilance as he made careful circles around the property. Hope stayed alert during the day, her ears constantly swiveling to catch any unusual sound, and even little Courage had developed the habit of growling softly when he sensed something strange, an early warning system that Thomas had come to trust. What surprised Thomas most was how these animals had transformed not only his daily routine, but his lonely heart that he had thought permanently frozen. For 20 years he had lived alone in this desert, convinced that solitude was safer than company, that isolation was preferable to the pain of loss and betrayal. But now, waking up each morning to see 3 pairs of golden eyes waiting for him with joy and affection had given him a purpose he had not known he needed, a reason to greet each new day with something other than weary resignation. "You know what, friends?" he told them one afternoon as they shared the sunset from the porch, the sky painted in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to set the desert on fire. "I think you rescued me more than I rescued you. I was dying inside, turning into a ghost haunting this ranch, and you brought me back to life." Guardian approached and rested his great head on Thomas's lap, a gesture of affection that had become routine between them, a daily affirmation of their bond. Hope lay at his feet, her breathing peaceful and content, and Courage settled against his leg, already half asleep with the absolute trust of youth. On the 7th day, his fears were confirmed in the most dramatic way possible. Thomas was repairing the barn roof, hammer in hand and nails between his teeth, when Guardian began to howl, a long, deep sound that made the blood freeze in his veins. It was not a howl of pain or calling to other wolves. It was a warning, urgent and unmistakable. On the horizon, a dust cloud was approaching rapidly, far too large to be 3 riders. Thomas counted at least 12 silhouettes against the sky, all armed, all with the clear intention of ending what the Salinas brothers had started. "Last chance, Herrera!" Victor Salinas shouted, his voice carrying across the desert. "Give us the wolves and leave the territory if you do not want us to burn your ranch with everything inside, including you." Thomas stepped forward, flanked by his 3 companions, creating an image that would become legend. A grey-haired man with his hair waving in the wind, holding a rifle with steady hands, accompanied by 3 wolves, who looked at him as their pack leader, their alpha, their family. "My answer remains the same," Thomas shouted back, his voice strong and unwavering. "Cruelty has no place on this land. If you want war, you shall have it, but know that you face not just a man, but a family united by something stronger than fear, stronger than your threats." "Then let it be a massacre!" Ricardo Salinas roared, spurring his horse forward. The 12 riders launched into a charge toward the ranch, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun, and the ground trembled under the gallop of their horses' hooves. But what happened in the following minutes would challenge everything these cruel men thought they knew about loyalty, courage, and the power of a family united by something stronger than blood. Thomas took cover behind a water barrel and opened fire with the precision of a veteran, his years of hunting serving him well, but his eyes filled with pride and amazement at seeing his wolf companions spring into action. They did not fight like wild animals in a frenzy. They fought like trained soldiers with strategy and purpose. The battle that followed would become legend throughout the region, told and retold in saloons and around campfires for generations. Thomas fired with the deadly precision of a sniper, each shot carefully aimed and rarely missing. But his 3 wolf companions demonstrated coordination and bravery that no human soldier would have surpassed. Guardian, despite his wounded leg that should have made him easy prey, moved like a grey shadow between the horses, using his weight and cunning to bring down riders with calculated precision. His tactic was perfect and showed an understanding of mounted combat that seemed impossible. He would approach from the blind side of the horses, leap to reach the riders' legs, and pull them from their saddles, leaving them vulnerable on the ground where Thomas could finish the job if necessary. Hope had developed an even more intelligent strategy that spoke to her understanding that the horses were innocent in this conflict. She ran in zigzag patterns between the horses' legs, nipping at their tendons just enough to make them rear and buck, but without seriously injuring them. Her goal was not to hurt the innocent animals, but to neutralize their evil riders, and she accomplished this with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Even little courage contributed to the battle in extraordinary ways that belied his small size. His diminutive stature allowed him to get into impossible spaces, darting between legs and under horses, distracting attackers at crucial moments and giving Thomas the opportunities he needed to place his shots effectively. The opening exchange of the battle lasted 15 minutes that felt like hours, time stretching and contracting with the adrenaline of combat. When the gun smoke began to clear, 4 of the gunmen lay motionless on the desert ground, their blood soaking into the sandy soil, and 3 more were wounded and retreating, clutching injuries as they fled. But the Salinas brothers continued fighting with the desperation of men who knew this was their last chance, their last opportunity to assert their dominance and cruelty. "Damned animals!" Diego Salinas screamed as he tried to aim at Hope, his hands shaking with rage and fear. "They are just beasts, nothing more than wild dogs." "You are wrong," Thomas responded, while reloading his rifle with practiced ease. "They are family, and family protects each other." Victor Salinas, furious at seeing how his men had been defeated by a cowboy and 3 wolves, decided to gamble everything on a final desperate card. He spurred his horse and charged directly at Thomas with a knife in each hand, screaming like a demon from the depths of hell itself. What happened next was so fast that later witnesses would call it a miracle, though Thomas knew it was something else entirely. It was love. Guardian, seeing the danger approaching his human protector, gathered all his remaining strength, despite the agony it must have caused his injured leg, and threw himself between Victor and Thomas. The attacker's knives sank into the noble wolf's chest, piercing deep into his body, but not before Guardian's powerful jaws closed around Victor Salinas's throat, ending the life of the cruelest man in the region with one final act of protective fury. "No, Guardian!" Thomas screamed, running toward his wounded friend, his rifle forgotten as he dropped to his knees beside the fallen wolf. The other attackers, seeing their leader dead and realizing they were fighting against something that transcended their understanding, something greater than mere animals and a man, threw down their weapons and fled toward the desert, knowing they would never again terrorize the innocent. Their reign of terror finally ended. Thomas knelt beside Guardian, who was breathing with difficulty, but kept his golden eyes fixed on those of his human friend, love and peace visible even through the pain. Hope and courage approached, whimpering with a sound that broke the soul, a lament that spoke of loss and grief that transcended species. "Easy, friend," Thomas whispered with tears he had not shed in decades streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You did it. You stopped them. They will never hurt anyone again. You are a hero, Guardian, a true hero." Guardian raised his great head one last time, using his remaining strength for one final gesture of love, and licked Thomas's hand as if to say that everything had been worth it, that he regretted nothing. In his eyes there was peace, pride, and a love so pure it transcended the barriers between species, breaking down the walls that civilization had built between man and nature. With one last breath, a soft sigh that seemed to carry his spirit to the desert winds, the brave wolf closed his eyes forever, having fulfilled his purpose of protecting the family he had chosen, the man who had shown him kindness when the world had shown him only cruelty. Hope howled with a sound that resonated throughout the desert, a lament that reached the heart of every living creature for miles around, calling to the very stars to witness their loss. Courage curled up against the still body of the one who had been his protective father, his small form shaking with grief. And Thomas Herrera, the lonely cowboy who had opened his heart to 3 strangers, wept as he had not wept since he was a child, knowing he had lost not just a companion but a true hero, a friend, a family member. The days that followed the battle were of deep mourning at the small ranch, but also of unexpected celebration throughout the region. Thomas built a gravestone of solid stone with the words "Guardian," "Hero and True Friend," carved deep into the rock, and every dawn he, Hope and Courage, visited the grave to pay homage to the brave wolf who had given his life to protect his chosen family. Hope had changed since the death of her mate, transformed by loss but not broken by it. She was no longer just a grateful wolf. She had become Thomas's protector, following him everywhere with a loyalty that bordered on the supernatural, as if she had taken on Guardian's role. Courage, for his part, had matured in extraordinary ways, as if the loss of his father had taught him the true meaning of responsibility and honor, forcing him to grow up faster than he should have. But the sadness began to transform into something unexpected when visitors started arriving at the ranch, drawn by the story that was spreading like wildfire through the territory. The first was Don Miguel Hernandez, the most respected rancher in the region, who arrived with his hat in hand and respect in his eyes. "Thomas," he said as he dismounted from his horse, his voice full of admiration, "the entire region has heard what you did. How you fought alongside those wolves against the Salinas brothers. How you defended the innocent when no one else dared. You have become a legend, my friend." Then came the complete Rodriguez family with provisions and offers of help, their wagon loaded with supplies and gifts. Then came the Thompson brothers, who had suffered abuse from the Salinas brothers for years and wanted to thank the man who had ended their reign of terror. By the end of the week, a constant stream of visitors had turned the ranch into a place of pilgrimage for all the good people of the region, all wanting to meet the man and wolves who had stood against evil and won. The months that followed saw the ranch transform into something unique in all of Arizona territory. Hope had given birth to a litter of 4 beautiful pups that combined her intelligence with Guardian's nobility, carrying on his legacy. The small wolves had grown surrounded by love, not only from their mother and courage, but from the entire community that visited the ranch regularly to see the miracle of the wolf family that lived in harmony with humans. The ranch had become known throughout the territory as Guardian's Refuge, a place where people could find justice, compassion, and hope in a harsh world that often seemed to have forgotten such concepts. 3 years later, Thomas still lived on his ranch with hope, courage, and the new generation of wolves, having found the family he never knew he needed. Every evening, when the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple, Thomas would sit on the same porch where it all began, surrounded by his chosen family, knowing he had found his place in the world through the love of 3 wounded wolves who had begged for his help and had given him so much more in return.